Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive, where we take the densest, most foundational source materials in history, sharpen our intellectual tools, and really try to extract the absolute core insights you need to know.
Today, we are taking on a source that, it isn't just an important book, it's the philosophical equivalent of the asteroid that ended the age of rationalism. We are diving into David Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature, which he published way back in 1739.
And when you read Hume's introduction, the sheer scope of his project is it's breathtaking. He wasn't just trying to solve one little philosophical problem. He was trying to establish the science of man as the single sole foundation for, well, literally everything else.
That's absolutely right. Hume looked around the learned world of the 18th century and he just saw chaos. He believed that all sciences, and we're talking about logic, morals, politics, criticism, even things like mathematics and natural philosophy, are ultimately dependent on the nature of the human understanding that judges them.
So if the foundation, the human mind itself, is shaky, then the entire building of knowledge just collapses.
Exactly. I mean, if you don't understand how the human mind operates, how can you possibly trust any knowledge that mind produces? That's really the core question.
And he saw his contemporaries failing that test miserably.
Oh, completely. He described the atmosphere as one of noise and clamor, where, even the most momentous questions lacked any kind of certain decision. Debates were just managed with extreme passion, as if everyone was certain, but the fact that there were so many arguments just proved everything was uncertain.
And I love his critique that the winners of these debates weren't the people who found the truth.
No.
It was the ones who were better at presentation, the trumpeters, drummers, and musicians of the army, as he so wonderfully puts it. Eloquence was beating sober truth.
And Hume's mission was to cut right through all that noise. He insisted that if we are going to proceed in philosophy, it has to be on the only solid footing we have, the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. We have to observe the mind like a physicist observes a falling object.
And that's our deep dive mission today. We are going to follow the architecture of this intellectual experiment. We'll start with the architecture of our understanding, so how we construct reality from just sensory input.
Then we'll examine the mechanical nature of our passions, how we feel, which is what leads us to act.
And finally, we'll see how Hume applies this whole system to demonstrate the surprisingly artificial roots of our morals and our society itself.
Yeah, it's a complete integrated system, and it's designed to show you that the things we take completely for granted, cause and effect, our own identity, the stability of the world out there, are often rooted in these surprising psychological mechanisms rather than pure objective reason.
Okay, so we're starting our anatomy of the mind at the ground floor. If Hume is building a science of man, he needs the most basic, the irreducible atoms of thought. What are they?
He calls them perceptions, and he immediately divides all perceptions into two kinds, and they're distinguished only by how powerfully they strike the mind. Their only difference is their degree of what he calls force and liveliness.
And the two categories are impressions and ideas.
Precisely. So impressions are those perceptions that enter the mind with the greatest force and violence. These are your raw, immediate experiences. Everything you see, hear, taste, or feel in the moment, sensations, passions, emotions. This is the original stuff the mind has to work with.
So the actual intense experience of being burnt by a match, for instance, that immediacy.
Yes. And in contrast to that, you have ideas. And ideas are just the faint images of these impressions. They're less lively, and they are what we use when we're thinking and reasoning. An idea is simply the recollection of that burn, or, planning how to avoid matches in the future.
It's the difference between feeling that sharp physical pain and just recalling the memory of that pain. The idea is obviously dimmer.
And Hume is absolutely insistent on this hierarchy. Impressions are the vivid originals, ideas are the derivative copies. And this leads him immediately to his foundational principle, which is so critical for limiting the boundaries of what humans can actually know.
The priority principle. That all simple ideas are derived from simple impressions that exactly correspond to them. So why is this statement so crucial for his whole system?
Because if this is true, it means the human mind can't just create truly new mental content out of thin air. Any simple concept like the smell of sulfur or the sensation of blue, it has to have an origin in a direct sensory experience. It locks our mental world tightly to the physical world of sensation.
It stops philosophy from just speculating wildly beyond observation. So how does he prove this? It seems like a simple enough claim, but back in the 18th century, a lot of philosophers thought the mind could generate innate ideas, completely separate from experience.
Right, and he offers two types of proof, and that they're based on just simple observation. The first is what he calls the constant conjunction and the order of their appearance. We always observe the impression coming before the idea.
Can you give me an example of that conjunction?
Sure. To give a child the idea of scarlet or bitter, Hume observes that you have to first present the object, the fruit, the dye, to convey the impression. You can't, just by using abstract language or thought, produce that vivid sensation if the underlying sensory experience hasn't happened yet.
Right.
He says it would be entirely absurd to try and excite the impression by just producing the idea. Ideas, on their own, they just don't have the force to spontaneously generate the original experience.
The vividness is always upstream of the faintness. Got it.
Exactly. And his second proof, which is really convincing, is what he calls the obstruction phenomenon. He notes that if the faculties that produce an impression are obstructed, so if a person is born blind or born deaf, the correspondent ideas are lost entirely. They just can't conceive of color or sound.
Wow, that's a powerful test case. It's as if you take away the source of the impression itself, you lose the idea completely. That proves the dependence.
And he challenges you, the listener, directly on this. If you try to form a just idea of the taste of a pineapple without ever having actually tasted it, you're going to fail. You can combine the ideas of other tastes, sweetness, bitterness, sharpness, but the unique, simple idea of that taste can't be built from pieces. It requires the original impression.
Okay, so Hume is saying that the building blocks of our entire mental universe are these simple impressions from sensation, and our ideas are just the memories or copies of them. Okay, so now that we have the pieces, how does the mind arrange them? Because our minds aren't just, a random jumble of ideas. They flow.
This is where we get into relations. Now, Hume first clarifies that the term relation in philosophy actually has two senses, which is important so we don't get confused.
And the first is the passive, purely intellectual sense.
Yes, the philosophical relations. This is just a basis for comparison, and it exists whether or not the objects are actually connected in our thoughts. They just give us the capacity to compare A and B. He lists 7 of them.
And these are the kind of relations that geometry or logic would operate on, right?
Precisely. They include resemblance, which you need for any comparison at all, identity of stable objects, space and time, things like contiguity or distance, quantity or number, degrees in quality, like hotter or colder, contrariety, and finally, cause and effect, which is unique.
Why is that one unique?
Because it's both a basis for comparison and a mechanism that naturally associates ideas in our mind.
Okay, so if those are the logical frameworks for comparison, what's the actual psychological engine that makes our minds move from one thought to the next? Why do I think of the color red and then immediately jump to the stop sign I saw this morning?
That is the work of the associating principles, the natural relations. The human mind, it can't fix steadily on one idea for very long. Our thought has to shift. And this transition isn't random. It's guided by 3 fundamental gentle forces: resemblance, contiguity, and causation.
Okay, so if I see a painting of a familiar face, that's resemblance, my mind naturally moves to the idea of the actual person. If I see a house, my thought naturally shifts to the neighborhood around it. That's contiguity.
Right. And if you see smoke, your thought naturally shifts to the idea of fire. That's causation. These 3 are the fundamental links that are constantly guiding the transition of thought in our imagination. They provide the easy transition or facility that lets us connect ideas and form these long, complex chains of reasoning.
It sounds almost mechanical, like our consciousness is just driven by these 3 habitual links, making the flow of thought smooth and predictable.
It is entirely mechanical. And of those 3, causation is by far the most powerful because it's the only one that lets us leap beyond our present impressions to infer something we haven't observed. Which brings us to the most radical part of Hume's anatomy.
Okay, let's turn the microscope on causation. When we talk about cause and effect, we assume there's this profound relationship, a necessary connection. We assume the effect must follow the cause. We literally live our lives based on this assumption.
And Hume asks, where do we get this idea of must? If we're following the experimental method, we can only appeal to what we actually observe.
So when we observe 2 things we call cause and effect, let's say one billiard ball striking another, what is the limit of what we see?
We see that the ball that moves first is near the second ball, that's contiguity. And we see that the movement of the first ball comes before the movement of the second, that's succession. And that is all. We never, not in a single instance discover any internal power or efficacy or force that actually produces the effect.
We see the events linked in time and space, but we don't see the magical force pushing them together. It's like an intellectual gap.
It is a profound, unbridgeable gap for reason. We try to define it, right? We say the cause is something productive of another, but Hume points out that if production just means causation, we're running in a completely meaningless circle. The observation of objects, even when you rack your brain, is insufficient to give us the idea of necessary connection.
So this means if I, as a philosopher, were transported to a brand new universe and saw two objects interact for the very first time, I couldn't rationally deduce what would happen next. I would only see proximity and sequence, not necessity.
Exactly. Rational deduction completely fails. And this is the moment of crisis in Book 1 of the Treatise. If reason and observation of the objects themselves can't produce this idea of necessary connection, where does this incredibly powerful idea, which forms the backbone of all science, actually come from?
All right, reveal the source.
It is derived entirely from custom or habit. The idea of necessity is not a feature of the objects in the world. It is an impression or a feeling within the mind itself.
Okay, let's elaborate on that mechanism. We see object A and object B joined together constantly in the past. Say, the sight of bread and the feeling of satisfying hunger.
Right, the constant conjunction. That repetition determines the mind to expect the effect when the cause appears. The repetition doesn't give us a new piece of rational information about the object. It simply creates a deep psychological propensity or habit in the mind to transition immediately from the idea of the cause to the idea of the effect.
And this transition crucially happens immediately without any new operation of the reason or imagination. It bypasses logic.
It does. We are psychologically determined to believe the effect will follow. And this habit creates the internal impression of necessity, and that impression is what we mistakenly project onto the external world as the necessary connection. The necessity is felt, not seen or logically deduced.
This radically redefines belief. I mean, if the foundation of our world is custom, then belief must be something entirely different from a purely rational judgment.
Oh, completely. Belief is not some simple abstract idea that we can logically separate from other ideas. It is a lively idea produced by a relation to a present impression. It's a more vivid and intense conception of an idea than, say, mere fiction or imagination.
So, believing that the sun will rise tomorrow isn't about grasping a logical truth. It's about having the idea of the sunrise strike us with this tremendous psychological force and vivacity because it's connected to the very deep impression of today and all the constant conjunctions of the past.
The feeling of conviction is, at its core, a species of sensation. When we're convinced of a principle, it is an idea that strikes more strongly upon us. Hume states that when we weigh arguments and decide between them, we are deciding from my feeling concerning the superiority of their influence.
That is genuinely unsettling. The ultimate judge of truth, even in rigorous science and philosophy, is a powerful, highly vivid, and intense feeling. It's a psychological measure, not some objective external standard.
And this mechanism is operating constantly, often completely unconsciously.
Right, let's talk about that example of unconscious reasoning. We don't always stop to logically recall every single past conjunction.
No, not at all. Think about a traveler approaching a deep, fast-moving river. They stop short and they avoid stepping in. Now, this decision is based on past experience, the habitual conjunction of water and sinking. But the mind doesn't consciously recall a sequence of memories of people drowning or specific gravity calculations.
The mechanism is just too fast for that.
The idea of sinking is simply so closely connected with that of water because of the established and uniform conjunctions of physics that the transition is instantaneous. It's an immediate determination by custom. The mind never has to expressly carry its view to consider past experience in these really strong habitual cases.
Okay, so if our most essential concepts, causation, belief, inference, are all based on fallible sensation and psychological habit, this sets up a huge skeptical challenge to even the fields we consider most certain, like mathematics. How does Hume attack the certainty of geometry?
He starts by attacking the very concept of the abstract idea. Hume argues pretty vehemently that abstract ideas are always individual in the mind, even if they become general in their application. You cannot form an idea of a triangle that is neither scaling nor equilateral, large nor small, light nor dark.
The moment you conjure the image, it has to have precise degrees of quantity and quality. The generalization only happens when we apply that individual idea to a bunch of related cases.
Right. And he uses this to undermine the supposed certainty of infinite mathematical concepts, specifically infinite divisibility. Philosophers claimed they could prove that extension space was infinitely divisible. Hume says that since no idea of quantity is infinitely divisible, our ideas have to be terminated by a finite last part. It's an evident absurdity to try and prove that quantity itself is infinitely divisible using these finite mental tools.
You can't use a finite idea to demonstrate an infinite truth. That's a devastating critique of rationalist mathematics. So where does that leave geometry?
Well, geometry, he argues, is fundamentally less certain than arithmetic or algebra. And why? Because the principles of geometry, when they touch upon extension in the real world, are derived merely from appearances, from what our senses convey. The idea of extension is copied from the impressions of colored points disposed in a certain manner.
And since we know the senses are inherently fallible, the eye can only judge size and proportion up to a certain point. Geometry can never achieve perfect certainty.
Exactly. It can only give us a distant notion of some unknown standard because it's always relying on the imprecise data delivered by our sense impressions. It's a radical statement. One of the pillars of the Newtonian age, geometry, is declared fundamentally uncertain because its starting point is fallible appearance, not the infallible comparison of pure ideas like you get in arithmetic.
And that contamination by sensation, it must also apply to our most basic understanding of the physical world, the notion of body and its continued existence.
Oh, absolutely. Hume then turns to the problem of the continued existence of body. Reason can never assure us that the external world, the table, the chair, exists when we turn our back on it, because we only ever have interrupted perceptions of it. The conviction that the world persists is entirely due to the imagination.
How does the imagination perform this essential trick?
It does it through two principles: constancy and coherence. We notice the constancy when resembling perceptions return after an interruption. So I leave the room, I come back, the room looks pretty much the same.
Okay.
And we notice coherence when the perceptions, even when they change, do so in a regular dependent way. I leave the fire, I return an hour later, the fire has predictably diminished.
So we see these interrupted perceptions, but because they're so similar and their changes are so regular, the imagination it bridges the gap.
The imagination finds the transition from the perception of the table yesterday to the perception of the table today so smooth that it mistakes the succession of related objects for the contemplation of one single, identical, continuous object. This illusion is essential to our notion of a stable physical reality. It's not logically necessary, it's psychologically unavoidable.
So the stability of the external world is a highly successful, necessary hallucination performed by our own imagination. How can we trust a philosophy that tells us this?
That is the power of the experimental method. It reports what is, not what we wish were true. And to finalize this demonstration that our mental operations are fundamentally mechanical, psychological, and non-rational, Hume offers the decisive test: the reason of animals.
This is where Hume really nails down his claim that his system is truly observational and experimental. If the fundamental mechanics of thought are just custom and habit, then they have to apply to all creatures that learn.
And he declares it's evident that beasts are endowed with thought and reason. Their actions avoiding danger, seeking pleasure, they proceed from a like cause and design as those of humans.
And the test, as you said, is beautiful in its simplicity. Any true hypothesis explaining a mental operation that's common to both humans and animals has to apply equally to both.
And most philosophers fail this test. They assume a subtlety and refinement of thought that is far beyond the capacity of common people, let alone animals. But Hume's system, based on present impression plus experience, applies perfectly.
So let's apply it. Animal mechanics. How does a dog reason according to this system?
Well, a dog infers his master's anger from the tone of his voice or the presence of game from a smell. That inference is built solely on the experience of constant conjunction. The dog has no access to the real connection between the smell and the game. It only relies on the past experience that one always follows the other. This requires minimal reflection and zero sophisticated rational processes.
So because beasts certainly never perceive any real connection among objects, they have to rely solely on custom to infer one from another.
It's a powerful validation. Because his simple experience-based system works for animals, it confirms its truth for human beings. And at the same time, it objects to every other system that demands complex, subtle rationalism to explain basic cognitive operations.
We've established that our understanding is founded on impressions, custom, and the imagination's tricks. So now we pivot, following Hume's structure, to the engine of action. the passions, how we feel.
Right. And impressions are divided, remember, into original and secondary reflective. Original impressions are sensations like bodily pain or pleasure, which arise without any prior perception.
Okay.
Secondary or reflective impressions are the passions and emotions, and they arise from the original ones, but they're often mediated by an idea.
So hitting your thumb with a hammer is an original impression, the pain. The fear or grief that immediately follows that realization, that's a reflective impression, a passion.
Exactly, and these passions are what ultimately motivate us. Hume spends a great deal of time on two foundational self-directed passions, pride and humility.
Right. And these passions are simple and uniform, but they're unique because they have a single, constant object, the self.
The object is self, which he defines as the succession of related ideas and impressions, of which we have an intimate memory and consciousness. When we feel pride, our focus is always the self. But critically, since they're contrary passions, one's pleasant, one's painful, the object can also be their cause. Otherwise, the self would just always cancel out its own passions.
That forces Hume to invent this really complex mechanism to explain how external factors can generate these self-directed feelings, the double relation system.
It is a bit complex, but you can think of it as a two-stage psychological jump. This system requires two distinct relations to align and then excite the passion.
Okay, let's walk through the example he uses of a beautiful house causing pride. What's the first relation?
The first is the relation of ideas. The cause has to be related to the object, which is the self. A beautiful house can only excite pride in me if it is mine. It has to be related to me through property or contrivance or family. The idea of the beautiful house connects to the idea of me.
Okay, the house is mine. Now, what's the second relation that actually generates the feeling of pride?
That's the relation of impressions. The sensation produced by the cause has to resemble the sensation of the passion itself. Pride is a naturally pleasant sensation. Humility is painful. Therefore, the quality of the cause, the house's beauty, has to independently produce a separate pleasure. This pleasure then makes it easy for the mind to transition to the pleasant sensation of pride.
So, let's see if I've got this straight. The house is beautiful, which generates pleasure. That's impression one. And because the house is mine, that's the idea relation, the mind easily transitions that pleasure into the specific, self-directed, pleasant sensation of pride, impression two. The relations kind of help each other out.
The transition is made with much greater facility because we get this double impulse from the relations of both our ideas and our impressions. And this system is how seemingly disparate things, from physical strength to wit to a nice garden, can all produce the same single impression of pride as long as they produce pleasure and are related to the self.
This mechanism also applies to his analysis of beauty and deformity. So what is the essential nature of beauty according to this emotional structure?
Well, beauty, just like the impression of necessity, is not an objective quality inherent in the object. Beauty is simply such an order and construction of parts as is fitted to give a pleasure and satisfaction to the soul. The very essence of beauty is the production of pleasure, and the essence of deformity is the production of pain.
So we don't admire a column because it's mathematically perfect. We admire it because its structure gives us a psychological sensation of satisfaction.
Exactly, and this links directly to utility. He notes that much of the beauty we admire is actually derived from the idea of convenience and utility. Why do we find a strong, well-proportioned animal beautiful? Because the idea of its strength suggests utility and security, which is inherently pleasant. The impression of pleasure is primary.
And this explains how external advantages and vanity work. Things that are physically distant from us, like vast estates or equipages or expensive clothing, they only influence pride when they acquire a strong relation to self through contiguity or causation.
Yeah, if you see a magnificent painting in a museum, you might feel admiration. But only if that painting is yours does that double relation kick in, transforming the generalized pleasure into self-directed pride. He does note an interesting exception here with resemblance, though.
The resemblance to a great man.
Yes. Resemblance seldom founds pride directly. If you resemble a great man in a truly valuable quality, you prefer to survey that quality directly in yourself. But if you resemble him only in trifles, the contrast between your trifling resemblance and his greatness often highlights your own minuteness, and that can lead to shame rather than pride. The relation of contrast can easily destroy the positive association.
Hume also uses this to explain complex social customs, like the preference for the paternal line in nobility or inheritance. It's not about superior biology.
No, it's a perfect illustration of the power of the imagination's transition. The strength of social relations depends entirely on the facility of the imagination's transition. Due to entrenched custom in society, which often favored the male sex in marriage and social leadership, the imagination finds the path of descent easier to follow through the father.
So the custom strengthens the psychological path from child to father.
Yes. That strengthened propensity of the imagination makes the paternal relation feel subjectively closer and more considerable than the maternal line, even if, logically, both contributed equally to the child's existence. It's not logic, it is established convenient habit that governs our perception.
Okay, now let's turn to the passions directed toward others, love and hatred. How do these differ from the self-directed passions?
The crucial difference is that they are not pure emotions. They inherently involve a direction toward action. Love is always conjoined with benevolence, the desire for the beloved person's happiness, and hatred is conjoined with anger, the desire for the hated person's misery. Pride and humility are just sensations. Love and hatred have an innate impulse to act.
And this difference allows for a second mechanism, the parallel direction of affections.
Right, and this is how our affections can transition based on shared or contrary interests. Think of two rivals in a zero-sum game. The pleasure or success of one instantly causes pain or failure in the other. This contrariety of interest causes hatred, independent of the double relation system.
Conversely, if two partners succeed together, the pleasure from the success of one easily translates to love and affection for the other, because the impulse, the desire for success, is shared.
The transition occurs because of the similarity of the direction of the affections, the desire for success or the aversion to failure. This explains why we often feel strong passions towards people we are closely involved with, even if they aren't directly related to us by blood or property.
And once again, Hume connects this back to the simplest form of life.
Yeah, love and hatred are common to animals. They judge objects by sensible good or evil. They acquire love simply by benefits, like being fed or cherished, and hatred by injuries. And crucially, animals also exhibit sympathy, the communication of passions. You can see grief, fear, or anger spreading through a herd without immediate knowledge of the cause.
The same simple mechanisms, sensation, association, and response to sensible good or evil, govern the entire spectrum of feeling, from a dog's affection to human vanity. We have finally arrived at the third pillar of the treatise, morals and society. And given everything we've established, that knowledge is built on sensation and action is driven by passions, Hume's conclusion here has to be explosive.
It is the ultimate rejection of rationalist ethics. Hume starts with the foundational claim. Morality has to influence actions. And since reason is inert, he calls it utterly impotent and cannot excite or prevent action. It follows immediately that moral distinctions cannot be derived from reason alone.
Right. Reason only deals with the truth or falsehood of ideas. Passions, volitions, actions. They're just original facts and realities. They just exist.
They can't be pronounced true or false. You can't say a desire is irrational in a moral sense, only that the means chosen to satisfy it are irrational. And this leads to his famous argument, reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them.
So the job of reason is not to choose the ends, my desire to be wealthy, but only to find the most efficient means, whether that's getting a job or, robbing a bank. The passion itself is morally neutral to reason.
Exactly. Reason can only serve passions by informing us of the existence of objects or discovering causes and effects, the means to an end. This single sentence upends centuries of classical philosophy that claimed reason should govern the appetites.
Let's use his powerful thought experiment, the parasite example, to prove that morality is not based on relations that reason can discover.
This is a devastating structural analogy. He says, consider a young sapling that grows up to destroy and outstrip its parent tree. That event contains the precise same objective relations, a cause of existence followed by a cause of destruction. As human parasite, a child murdering a parent.
Objectively, the relations are identical, yet we reserve moral condemnation only for the human act.
Right. And since the relations are the same, if morality consisted in those relations, the action of the tree would be equally vicious, which is absurd. Therefore, the difference must lie in the human capacity for choice and sentiment. Vice is not a fact we discover in the external world. It's an impression or a sentiment of disapprobation we find in our own breast when we reflect upon the action.
So morality is determined by an internal feeling. This foundation is then used to examine society's most critical rules, starting with justice. If morality is sentiment, can justice be a natural virtue?
And Hume concludes it is an artificial virtue.
Well,
He meticulously rejects the idea that a natural motive like universal or private benevolence could be the sole original spring of justice.
why does he reject benevolence as the original motive?
Because neither public, which is universal, nor private, which is particular, benevolence is sufficiently universal or strong. Why would I be just, meaning respecting the property of a miserable enemy who would gain little from his possessions, or a profligate debauchee who would misuse them? If private benevolence were the motive, justice would fail in all those cases where my natural affection is weak or non-existent.
And since a single, natural, universal motive is lacking, the sense of justice must arise artificially.
It arises necessarily from education and human conventions. These conventions are established to restrain the inherent self-interest and selfishness of men and to stabilize the possession of goods. A single act of justice, say, returning a vast sum of money to a great villain, may often be contrary to public interest, but the general system is necessary for society to function.
The general system works obliquely.
Yes. The rules of justice have to be general and inflexible, precisely because they restrain the human passion that would otherwise accommodate itself to circumstances. We have to adhere to the rule always, the oblique path, even when breaking it might seem beneficial in one single instance, the direct path, because maintaining the system is more important than achieving specific good.
And this artificial structure is supported by surprisingly trivial sources when we look at the specific rules that govern property.
Yeah, property, Hume states, is not anything real in the objects, but is the offspring of the sentiments. Take long possession or prescription. Why does time alone eventually create a right to property? Logically, the facts about ownership decades ago haven't changed.
But the influence on the imagination has changed.
Precisely. The imagination loses the sense of reality over a long interval. When a claim is made after 500 years, the imagination no longer has a lively connection to the original facts of ownership. So custom and time give solidity to the present possession, showing that property hinges on the strength of our mental associations, not some immutable fact.
And the rules for transference by consent, the act of buying and selling, are equally psychological. The laws often require physical delivery.
Right. Civil law often requires a sensible transference, handing over the keys to a house or even a piece of earth and stone to represent a manor. And Hume, with this delicious wit, compares this to the superstitious practice of Roman Catholic rituals.
Comparing common law rituals to religious superstition, that's classic Hume. Why does he draw that parallel?
Because the transfer of property is an inconceivable mystery to the unassisted mind. It's a transition of an invisible, abstract right. So to help the imagination conceive this invisible transition, we use a sensible symbol, the delivery of the key, a present impression, which, by a symbolic resemblance, the key represents the whole house, helps the mind grasp the otherwise intangible transition of ownership. It is a psychological scaffold.
Okay, moving from property to public authority, let's look at allegiance in government. We tend to think allegiance comes from some sort of rational contract.
Hume just dismisses the philosophical fiction of an original contract. While the duty of allegiance is at first necessary for social interest, its stability quickly becomes separate from the obligation of promises. Its ultimate stability comes from time and custom.
So how does custom legitimize even a tyrannical or rebellious origin?
When men have been long accustomed to obey a ruling family, the general instinct to suppose a moral obligation attending loyalty gradually takes that specific direction. Time alone gives solidity to the authority of governors. Even if the origin was usurpation and rebellion, custom gradually operates on the minds of men, and through the natural transition of thought, the mind transfers the sense of right to the long-possessed ruling power, making the authority seem just and reasonable.
So the longer a government lasts, the more legitimate it feels, regardless of its original sin. Custom trumps legal theory.
And this need for stability leads to inflexible general rules for political succession. These rules, say, preferring the eldest son, are necessary to restrain the human passion and private interests that would otherwise try to manipulate circumstances for personal gain. The inflexibility of the rule ensures order, even if the designated successor is clearly incompetent.
And finally, let's analyze what Hume identifies as the most artificial virtue: chastity and modesty. This really reveals how even our most deeply personal moral codes are social mechanisms.
The vast difference in moral duties and education for men and women is traced back to a single, fundamental, and indeed trivial and anatomical observation. The difficulty men have in attaining security regarding paternity because the principle of generation goes from the man to the woman.
And since male investment labor, time, resources, and offspring requires assurance of paternity, society has to create a rule to guarantee it.
The social solution is to impose constraints on women through the punishment of bad fame or reputation. Society attaches a peculiar degree of shame to infidelity, far beyond what the act of injustice itself might demand. This punishment of bad fame is inflicted even upon mere surmises and conjectures that a court of law would never admit. It's a social mechanism of control designed purely to stabilize the investment structure of the family unit.
And just like the political rules, this rule is later extended far beyond its original utility.
Exactly. The rules of modesty and chastity are applied universally, even to women who are past childbearing age, because the general rule carries the imagination beyond the specific utility. Once society establishes a powerful moral constraint for an entire group, the psychological momentum of the rule applies it indiscriminately, confirming again that our moral systems are driven by the mechanical force of generalization, not refined reason.
So if all morality is artificial, how do we get the sentiment of approval? Why do we approve of virtues like justice and allegiance, which often contradict our private interests?
That approval is generated through sympathy. Sympathy, the communication of passions, allows us to feel pleasure when we reflect on qualities that tend to the good of mankind, even if we aren't personally involved. We approve of justice because, through sympathy, we feel pleasure contemplating its beneficial effect on society.
But if morality is based on sentiment, and my personal feelings of affection and approval vary wildly based on proximity, I might feel more love for my diligent servant than I do for a historical hero like Marcus Brutus. How do we achieve a stable, consistent moral judgment?
We have to fix on a steady and general point of view. We achieve stable moral judgment by correcting our momentary variable sentiments. We reflect that, were we to approach the renowned patriot, Marcus Brutus, he would command a much higher degree of admiration based on his general utility to humanity.
We use the general viewpoint to override the momentary appearance.
Exactly. And this method of correcting our sentiments is common to all the senses. We use language and shared reference points to achieve a stable standard, separating the accident of fortune, whether I happen to be standing next to the person, from the stable disposition, the character's actual moral value. This allows us to communicate shared moral sentiments effectively.
This has been an extraordinary exploration, following Hume's experimental method deep into the fundamental machinery of human nature. Before we wrap up, let's synthesize the 3 shocking and monumental findings that result from this anatomy.
First, in understanding, we discovered that our knowledge is built entirely on the shaky foundation of impressions, and our beliefs, including the bedrock concept of cause and effect, are not rational necessities but powerful subjective sensations generated by customary habit.
Second, in feeling and action, we learned that the very idea of rational self-control is fundamentally flawed. Reason is inert and acts only as the servant to the passions. And our own identity and the existence of the external world are necessary illusions successfully managed by the imagination.
And third, in morals and society, we concluded that our most sacred systems, justice, property, government, gender morality, are not derived from eternal immutable truths, but are artificial conventions born out of social utility, established by custom, and perpetuated by the mechanical forces of the imagination's generalizations.
The rigorous application of reason, following observation to its most generalized conclusion, leads to this undeniable result. Hume admits that when reason follows its most general principles, analyzing the foundations of causation, identity, and the external world, it entirely subverts itself.
And this is the moment of philosophical melancholy, the intellectual realization that if we trust our deepest reasoning processes, we are left with total debilitating skepticism, with not the lowest degree of evidence in any proposition. The mind, having destroyed all certainty, is just paralyzed.
So if applying reason consistently leads to this dizzying abyss, what is the ultimate solution? What's the cure for this philosophical despair?
The solution is not more philosophy. Hume says that when reason is incapable of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices to that purpose. We are rescued from skepticism not by superior logic, but by biology, habit, and society.
We return to common life.
We do. We dine. We play a game of backgammon. We converse. We are merry with our friends. A few hours of this amusement totally destroys the force of the deep speculations. The abstruse arguments appear cold and strained and ridiculous. We are absolutely and necessarily determined to live and talk and act like other people in the common affairs of life. We are saved from intellectual ruin by the irresistible force of habitual, natural living.
It's the ultimate psychological retreat. We cannot live by the conclusions of our own philosophy, so we have to rely on the habits we share with the dog and the savage.
The great lesson of the treatise is that the non-rational, the emotional, and the customary are not merely interruptions to our enlightened life. They are the unavoidable, necessary foundation that makes life possible in the first place.
Which leaves us with this provocative final thought for you, the learner, to consider. If our most fundamental beliefs about the world, our sense of personal identity, and the rules that govern society, from property rights to morality, are based merely on custom and the trivial properties of the imagination, and not on rational certainty, what is the true, non-negotiable basis upon which you live your daily life? And more importantly, can you ever truly escape the force of habit, even when you know the habit is logically unsound?